Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. On this episode, I'm joined by fellow Virginian Chris Reilly, the founder and owner of Reilly Rod Crafters. Chris shares his fishing journey, his thoughts on rod design, and the story behind his rod company. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And one more quick announcement. Our friend Blaine Chocolate has launched a new round of online tying classes for April. He'll be teaching folks how to tie the changer craw and his famous cicada pattern. The classes will be held live on April 10th, and all the details are in the show notes. Space is limited, so don't delay. Now, on to our interview. Well, Chris, welcome to The Articulate Fly.
Thanks, Marvin. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight, and we have a tradition on The Articulate Fly. We always ask all of our guests to share their earliest fishing memory.
Oh, wow. So my earliest memory would have to be fishing with my father. I believe it was Jeanette's Pier down in Nag's Head. And it was one of those just amazing runs of spot and croaker. And I think maybe I was 4. And, we were out there half the night just catching them 2 at a time. And it was just an absolute blast. It was a great experience, and it was fun to be out there with all the others. You saw, sort of the camaraderie that was happening, and everybody was catching fish, and everybody was happy. It was a good experience. It was a great experience.
Yeah, that's really neat. When did you come to the dark side of fly fishing?
It would have been somewhere around the age of 12, 13, somewhere in there. Never really had any inclination, no tendencies to that. But I was a freshman in high school, so I must have been 13. I was a freshman in high school, and there was this guy in my homeroom that liked to hunt and fish just like I did. And so we sort of became fast friends. And then I started hunting and fishing with him and his father. My father was much, much older. He was 40 when I was born and pretty beat up from World War II. So, we didn't do a whole lot of that, particularly later. So I was always out with my friend Tracy and his dad. And his dad was actually the one that introduced me to fly fishing. And taught me, from that point forward, really. Really neat to have somebody like that sort of take you under their wing and mentor you and sort of treat you like, one of his own.
Yeah, and that was Chuck Kraft, right?
That was Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just any mentor to take you under his wing either.
Well, what's interesting is I didn't necessarily realize that until several years later. And my first wife and I had moved out to Fluvanna County and started going to a church out there. And every Sunday morning, I ended up out on the front steps of the church talking to this old gentleman about hunting and fishing. And I'm horrible with names. And I was introduced to him, and I don't even think I heard the name because I would have remembered. And then finally, and you know how that goes, after you talk 2 times, then you're embarrassed to ask, by the way, what's your name? But I found a way to do it sort of slyly, and it was Bob Gooch, who was one of the old Virginia outdoor writers, and we got to be good friends. And Bob and his wife Ginny invited my wife and I to their house, which was just down the road from ours, for dinner one night. And he asked me about, so when and where and how did you learn to fly fish? And I said, well, Chuck Kraft taught me, and I knew Chuck, some people knew him, so I figured, Bob would know that name. And he was like, my Lord, son, do you realize the advantage you've had? And I started really realizing how fortunate I was and continued to be, thank goodness.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I can remember growing up in Central Virginia. Not very many people fly fished at all.
No. It was something that it was something. At least I grew up with the impression that it was something that you did out west. It was a Montana thing or a Colorado or Wyoming thing. You just didn't really hear about it. And I don't think until that point I knew anybody else that fly fished.
Yeah, I can certainly say I didn't growing up. My first experience, we had family friends that had a place in Rockbridge or Botetourt County. And I can remember going in their shed one day and there was just an ancient fly rod up on the wall with a fly. And I was like, can I go play with this? And I went and played with it and caught some trout. But that was, I was a gear worm dunking guy as a kid.
Yeah. Well, and that's how Chuck taught Tracy and I to trout fish originally. We'd go seine minnows out of the creek and, drift dace minnows in the trout streams. And that's how we caught trout. And then, later we started using Joe's flies and things like that. And then finally graduated to a fly rod. But yeah, it just wasn't that big of a thing.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. And in addition to Chuck, who are some of the other folks that have mentored you on your fly fishing journey, Chris?
Well, certainly Bob Gooch was a mentor in so many ways, fly fishing, hunting, and life in general. There's also an older gentleman that I got to know quite by accident. His name was George Engelhardt. And how I got to know him was a good friend of mine that I used to bird hunt with. He put a deposit down on a puppy, and I think it was unbeknownst to his wife. And when she found out, she was like, absolutely not. We're not having another puppy. We've got 3 dogs in the house. So he ended up giving me his spot in the litter, but I actually had to interview to be able to accept that spot. And it was interviewing with George that was the breeder. And George really isn't a breeder or wasn't a breeder. He would follow the field trial circuits and, take copious notes. And, once every 3 or 4 years, he'd have a litter with one of his females, and whichever male caught his attention. So we sort of got connected through bird hunting and English setters. And then it turned out that George, being the old New England gentleman that he was a big-time fly fisher also. So those guys, in my early years, and then later, it was, once I sort of got into the industry, Stu Apt. Stu took me under his wing. He's treated me like a son from the day I met him. Certainly had some influence from Flip Pallett. Had some good influence from Gary Loomis. So, yeah, I've been fortunate. I've been very, very fortunate.
Yeah, you haven't done too badly. And, it's interesting too. I knew that you bird hunted, and you were talking about it just a few minutes ago, but, one of the great things about where we're from is, Central Virginia is really, if you're a sportsman, it's a great place to be. How did growing up in that part of the world influence your sporting life?
Oh, wow. It could have gone so much differently because my parents were both New Yorkers from the city. And they lived in New Jersey when they started having kids, but it was Paramus, New Jersey. So, just the other side of the river. And they moved down to Charlottesville when, I think it was 2 years before I was born. That's when they moved down. And one of the reasons I moved down here was because my mother's sister, her youngest sister, lived here. And she was married to this fella that he grew up on a farm. He was one of, 7, 8, 9 boys. It was a Kaysen family. And, these were guys, their family was part Mattaponi, and they hunted and fished and gardened and, were into all the natural crafts and things. And that, as much as anything, sort of got my interest in just being outdoors. And so, in living where we live, gosh, you're right. I mean, there's just so much opportunity. You can go from where I live, you can go an hour and a half in one direction and bring a fly rod and a 20 gauge and grouse hunt and trout fish all on the same, chunk of property. Or you could go 2.5 hours in the other direction and go surf fishing. And it's sort of the sky's the limit. Just pick what you want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think until I went to Montana, I always said that if I won the lottery, I'd buy a big horse farm in Albemarle County.
Yeah. And that actually was a piece of advice that Bob Gooch gave me, because I remember sitting at dinner with him and Jenny one night, and I was 27, 26. And he said, so son, have you been to Montana yet? And I said, well, no, sir. That's a dream. I'd really like to get out there, but I haven't been to Montana yet. And he said, go before you're 30, because you're not going to want to spend any more time in Virginia. And this is from an old Virginian. His family's been here since the Mayflower, and he was right in a lot of ways, but I've had the opportunity to do a lot of traveling, and either through work or for pleasure, and I still always want to come back to Virginia. As good as it can be in other places, Virginia's it.
Yeah, it's funny because, growing up in Lynchburg, like so many of the people that I went to high school with, all we wanted to do was escape. And now so many of us, all we are trying to do is figure out how to get back. Exactly.
When I grew up, it was like, I'm getting out of Charlottesville. I'm not going to spend another minute in Charlottesville. And, when I was working in the early part of my career, I would spend, 3 to 4 weeks out on the road, be home for a week, and then go do it again. And all these places that I loved being. Minneapolis and central Minnesota was sort of one of my first addictions. And I really wanted to move out there, but then I realized every time I flew home and you're looking out the window and you start seeing the Appalachians pop up, you felt like you were home. And I just couldn't escape that feeling. Got to be in the mountains.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny, they're beach people and mountain people, and I know I'm definitely a mountain person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I know you have a technical background, but, what attracted you, Chris, to rod design and manufacturing?
Honestly, it was one of the furthest things from my mind. It's interesting. One of the last big assignments that I had in sort of the corporate world. So I went to work for a little company called NITEC that, was the owner and 12 engineers when I went to work for them. They were up in Northern Virginia. They had just moved out of the owner's garage, and they had a real hot technology. And it was a very unique radar. whose application was perfect for basically finding IEDs and landmines. And, they brought me on board because they had a project going on that was in 5 or 6 years. It was working with BAE systems. And in 5 or 6 years, it was going to lead into production. And I had a strong technical background, but also had been in manufacturing most of my life. And, the owner thought, okay, well, this is like the perfect fit, so we'll hire this guy. He'll manage this program. And when it does go into production, we'll have him start production. Well, sort of long story short, we parted ways with BAE Systems and had an opportunity to send our equipment over to Afghanistan for an operational evaluation. And it was supposed to be there, I think, 2 months. It ended up being 6 months. And the generals basically didn't want to have the equipment leave and come back to the States. And their orders were, we want them now and we want them by the hundreds. So I was immediately thrown into the situation where I need to come back down to Charlottesville and, start up a manufacturing organization. And that's what I did. I started with 5 people. And ultimately, and it was a super sharp curve. I think it was 3 years later, I had 250 something employees, and we were doing just shy of $250 million of manufacturing revenue.
Wow.
And generating these systems, and they would go directly from my factory onto flatbed trucks to Dover, onto a C4, and over to Kandahar. And it was a great project, but it really sort of burned me out. And along the way, the owner, this guy named Fred Clodfelter, he's a great guy, and he's a fly fisherman and bird hunter also. Fred knew that I liked to smallmouth fish and that I liked to fly fish, and he was big on just doing little surprise things for folks. And he gave me a 7-weight fly rod. I won't say who made it, but it was a beautiful rod, absolutely gorgeous. And it was an expensive rod, but I could not stand fishing with this thing. I mean, it was work. And, it made me question my skills initially. And, it got down to, okay, I can handle the rod, but it's just not fun. And I started thinking about, where the industry had headed. And it sort of took this turn for making rods faster and faster and faster and lighter and lighter and lighter. And, I understood how they were doing that with the materials. And I just said, this isn't going to go well, ultimately. I don't know how long it'll take, but I don't think it's going to go well. We're going to end up with a lot of breakage. And, quite honestly, is that really what people want? Because when I started talking to folks, they were looking for rods like I wanted, and to me, it was the rods that I grew up and learned to fish with, which meant a very progressive taper, a softer, smoother action. I could easily feel the rod load. It was accurate and it was pleasurable. You could just instinctively cast and didn't have to always be thinking about your timing and how that would change as your line went out because you couldn't feel the rod load. So when NITEC took a turn south, and that all came about because of the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, and all of a sudden this one product this company was built on was no longer in demand. I left, and just thought, okay, well, what's my next project going to be? And I thought more about my experience with that fly rod and the things that it made me think about. And I said, we can do this. We can do this. And we'll build the kinds of rods that we like to fish, that I like to fish. And it turns out a lot of other people like that type of rod as well. So that was sort of the genesis. That's how we started.
Sure. And I mean, I understand the attributes and, certainly, and it's interesting too, because, I find that people that have been around the sport longer and, really could fish any stick they want to almost always are migrating back to a medium, to a medium fast action rod with a little bit more feel.
Right. And in my opinion, if there's one designer that really nailed it, and I just hold in extremely high regard, and that was Tom Morgan. And these are the kinds of rods that Tom would design. They were just really, really soulful rods and a pleasure to fish.
Yeah. And so how do you kind of take, what I guess the end consumer feels and likes, and how does that kind of show up as a design philosophy? And how do you kind of, go from, what the consumer wants, and what does that mean from a design philosophy perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think really our design philosophies have changed that much with our customer interaction. If anything, it's just sort of re-emphasizing that, this really seems to be what this group of customers really wants. The challenge has been, as a small company and bootstrapping it out of, your own funds, it is overcoming all the marketing hype. And really trying to figure out how to get down to not what the customer thinks he wants based on a magazine ad or based on some hype on social media, but, when they actually get a rod in their hands, what do they really want? What really feels good for them? What really lets them enjoy their fishing and not find it frustrating? And that's been the challenge. That will continue to be the challenge. And we address that in a couple of different ways. We started doing a program with our guides that fish our rods, and, we'll give them a code and a bunch of courtesy cards. And, when their clients fish our rods and they love them, which they usually do, they can just hand them one of those cards at the end of the trip and say, hey, listen, if you're interested, if you want to pick up one of these, go to this website, use this code, and you can get 10% off your rod. And the guide gets a little bit of a commission, for that as well. Because that's the way our rods are sold. It's by putting them in people's hands and letting them feel the difference.
Sure. And I guess, to maybe if we walk through sort of like the back cast and the forward cast and kind of a comparison with, I guess what's kind of become kind of the norm, which is, very fast or ultra fast rods, kind of let folks know that haven't had a chance to cast one of your rods, kind of what it feels like and what the difference is.
Yeah. So the difference that you'll feel really from the start is that there's much more flex in the rod. These generally are not tip flex rods, where only the top 18 inches of the rod has much of any flex into it. These are progressive tapers. I have some parabolics as well, but but generally we're talking about progressive tapers. You'll see them flex well down into their midsection, and that's by design. I think sometimes people think that means the rod's, undersized or it's weak, but it's actually letting the rod do what it's intended to do, which is to store energy and then transfer it to the line. So when you first pick up your line, you'll see, particularly if the line's in the water and you've got some water loading going on, you'll see a pretty steep arc in that rod, but it's going to flex back. It's going to counteract that force, and it will launch your line, back into a great back cast. And as it starts to come taut, you'll feel the tip of the rod starting to load and bend back under that pressure. And, it's very easy to get tuned up to where, you can feel that loading build, and it just starts to slack. And, a split second later, you take your forward cast, and the same thing happens in reverse.
Yeah, and then you get the recovery, which is going to be a lot smoother because there's so much more flex in the rod.
So much more flex in the rod. And then one of the real tricks is to be sure, you got to counteract that flex, particularly in the tip, with a little bit of design to ensure that you get good dampening of the tip. It doesn't just sort of bounce back and forth like a loose spring. Because that certainly is going to, first of all, it consumes energy, so it's going to take some distance out of your cast, but it's also going to impact the accuracy of your cast.
Yeah, you'll have a bunch of little wavies in the bottom leg of your loop.
Yep, and I'll see guys that are very experienced casters, but they're used to some of these super fast rods, and you'll see them cast a couple of times, and you'll see those wavies, and, they'll say, oh, you've got really bad tip dampening. And the answer is, no, you're really overpowering the rod.
Yeah, I was going to say, you probably also see those guys throw a lot of tailing loops too.
Absolutely. So, yeah, it's to me, it's just a much more instinctive way of casting. And for me, casting is just a means to an end. It's necessary to get our fly to a fish. And the whole point of being there is to enjoy your environment and hopefully catch a few fish. It's not to cast.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting because it really is a tool, right? And sometimes we lose sight of that.
Right. And so I'll tell people, I'm actually agnostic. There are times where I'm just going to grab my spinning rod or my casting rod because, particularly a spinning rod, if it's a really windy day and I still want to fish because it's the only day I'm going to be able to get out, I'm not necessarily going to mess around with the fly rod that much. I may bring it, but I'm going to bring a spinning rod too. I guarantee it. And it's interesting that a lot of people that I grew up respecting in the sport were very much the same way. Certainly Chuck was that way. And when you talk to Stu Apt, he's like, Chris, it's a tool. And sometimes it's a great tool, and sometimes it's just the wrong tool for the job. You go to your spinning rod, you go to your casting rod.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I always, when I talk to gear guys, I always tell them that I think one place that, because obviously like muskie fishing is a place where fishing for them on the fly is a lot of work. Yep. But also I think, one place where I think fly rods really excel are basically like fishing lily pads for largemouth bass. I think it's a better tool.
I do too.
Right.
I do too.
Yeah. It's interesting. And so, it's kind of, I always think of, when I think of your rods, I sort of think of nostalgia, but with all the modern engineering and materials.
And that's the idea. that is the idea. When I talk to people about our rods, we'll talk about accuracy. We'll talk about feel. We'll talk about, getting to the point where you're able to just focus on where you are and your fishing and not your casting, which has sort of always been my objective for people. But, one of the questions that comes up is, and it's for guys that are, they're listening to all the ads and they're seeing all this information and they're not quite sure what to make of it, but they'll say, yeah, but your rod weighs, 3/8 of an ounce more than this other one. And that's absolutely true. And they always will, because I do use, particularly at the core, I do use older, lower modulus material, and I roll thicker walls to our blanks. And that really has to do with making sure that we have as little breakage as possible. Thin walls, high modulus, asking for trouble, there's going to be breakage. There's no question. It's going to happen.
Yeah, I would imagine a critter mite or a crawdad whacking a rod tip is a bad thing, right?
It's not good, no, for any rod.
So it's interesting. I know you touched on this a little bit earlier about, one of the challenges about being a smaller rod manufacturer is we sort of have this, we've not just in fly fishing, I mean, pretty much in everything now, if it's 2 years old, it's really old. Right.
Right.
And, how did you overcome that challenge, and what other challenges did you face as you kind of got into the rod manufacturing business?
Well, the challenges are certainly, it's certainly in getting the customer's attention. And, we quickly realized that we weren't going to do that by advertising, and we do some. But, we don't have much of an advertising budget. We do it by getting them in people's hands. The other issues are material costs. Something as basic as that. I'm not producing 20,000 rods a year. So I'm not getting the kind of pricing that some of those guys get. And that means that I don't have the kinds of margins that those guys get. So then we have to start talking about, what the warranty issues are. How do you administer warranty? And I take a different approach to that than most of the rest of the industry has. And that takes a little bit of explanation and a little bit of customer education. But once you explain, it's like, yeah, boy, that makes sense. Why am I doing that? And by that, I mean, a lot of companies, their pricing model is such that there's so much margin in their rods. It's so easy to offer a no fault, lifetime warranty. And when you sit down and you do the math on that, it doesn't work. Unless you're charging, a 2 or 3 or 400% markup on this rod. And there's so many guys that are like, well, this is great, so I can just send it in no matter what happened. I slam the car door on it, they're going to send me a new rod. And I'm like, wow, did you stop to wonder how they can afford to do that?
I thought they were just nice people, Chris.
Well, I think that's sometimes what people think, but again, sit down and do the math. And I'm saying, you know what? I'm not going to charge you that because, some of these prices are exorbitant. I'm not going to charge you that and basically make you pay for everybody else mistreating their gear. If there's a real defect in workmanship or material, no question, absolutely, we'll make that right without question. if you slam the car door on it and you tell me, hey, Chris, I'm sorry, but I slammed the car door on it, generally I'm going to repair it for what a lot of companies charge for their warranty administration fees. And that's, that's not really making money on it. It's sort of covering my cost. But, warranty for me was never intended to be a profit center.
Yeah. Obviously those are some of the challenges, but also being smaller has its benefits. I'm sure you're a lot nimbler than a large organization.
Oh, absolutely. And, we talk about that quite a bit. I've got guys all the time. And again, we've got a strong guide network and a lot of loyalty with those guides. And, the thing is, they'll come up with an idea or, I think this would be really great, but it's kind of a limited application. And, if it makes sense, okay, let's try it. We can build 6 of those. We can roll 6 of those blanks. We can build 6 of those rods. We can see, and I can do it in, 5, 6, 7 weeks, as opposed to, well, we got to plan a whole production run and, you're going to have to buy 500 of them to make this work. And it'll take, 9 to 10 months. So, the mantra that I've been sort of adopting from Outback is, no rules, just right.
There you go. And, as we mentioned, you're not in this kind of annual or biannual, product cycle. And you have 5 series that have, been pretty stable since you launched the company. And I was wondering if you could kind of, walk folks through them, and I'm happy to tick them off and have you talk about them or however you want to skin that cat.
Yeah, no, if you want to tick them off, if you want to tee them up for me, I'll.
Yeah, sure. So, you've got the Chuck Craft Signature Series, right?
Right. And that all came about because I was at a point in my life where I was, really, really counting my blessings. And I thought, my gosh, this man has done so much for me and so much for the industry, but he kept such a low profile and never really got all the accolades. I want to do something with him, for him. And, I approached Chuck with the idea, let's do a series of rods and, let's focus it on smallmouth and see where that goes. And maybe we'll expand it a little bit. And, so he and I sat down and talked, okay, so what for you makes a great rod? And he talked about a rod that was made many, many, many years ago when he was a guide and he was a pro staffer for this rod company. It's a great rod company. They're still around. And they made this series of rod that was a staple in his boat. And he said, I'd have clients that would show up with these $1,000 rods they couldn't handle, and, they couldn't cast it, and they'd get frustrated, and, they wouldn't want to switch and use my rod. He said, so I learned to just sort of back off until lunchtime, and then just after the lunch break say, hey, why don't you fish this rod for a while? And he put the rod in their hands, and he's like, in 15 minutes, they're casting proficiently and catching fish. And the whole day changed for them. So, we talked about the characteristics of that rod series. And it was all the things that we've talked about. It was a full flex rod. It had a ton of feel, yet it still had a lot of backbone to handle some of the bigger fish. A softer tip to protect the tippet, but certainly not too soft. And everything right down to the color. And that's what sort of launched the CK series. And I took all of that information, went to a good friend of mine that has collaborated on a lot of our blank designs and has a blank shop up in Pennsylvania, and said, okay, Mike, let's work through this. And the first one that we were going to do was a 6-weight. And we had, I don't know, it was less than 20, but not much less than 20 iterations of that design. And finally, we just said, yeah, okay, this one didn't quite making it, but Chuck put a 5-weight line on it. And he was like, oh my God, Chris, this is the best 5-weight I've ever cast. So, we set the bar down at a 5-weight now, and we started translating up from there. And the 6 came easily after that. The 8 came easily after that. The 7-weight was a challenge, and we're hitting a couple of material boundaries there, and we had to reassess how we were approaching the design. And with the 7-weight, I think we had 27 different design iterations, and build them up. Chuck and I would go out and fish them, and it's not quite right. We need to tweak it again, and finally, I remember when I brought that 27th blank to him, built up, and we fished it, and his first cast, he was like, "My God, this is it, and this is perfect." And it is the darling of that series. It's the rod that everybody absolutely loves. They love the 6, they love the 7. I mean the 8, and the 5 has a very small niche that it fits. But the 7 is the darling. There's always one.
Yeah,
there's always one in every series.
Yeah, and that's the perfect smallmouth rod, right?
Yeah. No, and as far as I'm concerned, it is a great all around rod. If we're not talking trout, of course, a lot of people use it for streamer rods for their trout fishing as well. But it's a great smallmouth rod, largemouth. I've got guides that use them regularly for redfish. There's a bunch of guys down in the Virginia Beach area that use them and, just have a blast with them on some of the big gator trout. It's a great rod.
Yeah, and then I can't remember if Chuck's rods were the first ones you made, but I know, I guess Stu's were not too far behind it if they were second.
Stu's were the first, and Stu's design, the base design, I can't take any credit for whatsoever. Stu worked with a now defunct Diamondback rod company, and there is a rod company by that name, but it's not the same rod company. And Stu's rods are 3-piece configurations, and that particular group of Stu's rods will remain 3-piece. I know that turns people off sometimes, but honestly, I've not had any trouble traveling with them. That's usually the objection. But Stu's rods have 2 hinge points, if you will. It's a parabolic type taper. And they're specifically designed for Stu's style of casting and fighting fish. I remember the first time I saw Stu do this as a demo for me, and it just blew my mind. So, he'd talk about being up in the front of a boat out on the flats and, you're sight fishing. And, you'd see a fish at 50 feet, 60 feet. And, he'll say that what led to all of his world records was being very accurate and very fast and not blinding fish. Those are the 3 things that he would talk about. And then he'd talk about his fighting tactics. But, a fast, accurate presentation was sort of paramount. And he's got this fast cast technique that is just amazing to me. He'll strip off, 60 feet of line, and he'll have it up there on the bow on the platform, and he'll take maybe 20 feet out of the end of the tip of the rod and just sort of let it hang loosely. And he's got the fly in his hand, in his left hand, and the fly rod in his right hand. When he sees his target, he'll do this little sort of easy roll and let the fly go. And he'll shoot back and cast forward and shoot all of that line basically without a false cast, and right on target. And so it takes a rod with some sort of special characteristics, and certainly it had to be accurate. So it had to be spined properly. It had to have good dampening. But those were the characteristics that his rods needed to display, as well as a lot of backbone. Because one thing about Stu, when you're fighting fish, you let him know who's boss from the very first second, and you don't let up. And his results speak for themselves. He's done very well with that. He's told me when we were prototyping a 9 weight, he had 140-pound tarpon on the 9 weight. He landed in 12 minutes.
Yeah,
and that's, wow. Most people, they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I fought that fish for 45 minutes."
Yeah.
It's like, nope.
On to the next fish. And, and then you've also built series, with Joe Muller and Debbie Hansen.
I did. Joe Muller, that was an interesting one. So Joe had come to Virginia to the fly fishing festival that Bo Beasley does. And I think he came with New Canoe. I hadn't met Joe at that point. And Joe was doing some casting demonstrations from a kayak. And, he was talking about, minimizing motion and keeping all the motion within the confines of the kayak, so you're not, slapping the water with the sides of the boat or risking flipping it over and all that. And Joe, I mean, he's a great showman. He's a great guy, but he's a great showman. He gets people's attention. And Chuck was sitting there watching it and just really amazed at what Joe's casting technique is. And when Joe finished up the demo, Chuck ran out and grabbed him and shoved his 7-weight, his CK 7-weight, and said, "I want you to do your next demo with this rod." and Joe will say, you don't say no to Chuck, whether you know him or not. You don't say no. And so he took it and he's like, "Well, okay, I guess I'll do my next demo with this rod." And Joe cast the rod in the demo, and it was kind of interesting. The first time he made a couple of casts with it. He was like, "My God, this is one of the best 7-weights I've ever cast in my life." And that's when Joe and I sort of got connected. He came over and talked to me afterwards, and we talked about rods, and we got to be pretty quick friends. And we came up with the idea of doing a 2-rod series for him that had a unique flat spot in the grip, which is sort of somewhat unique to Joe's style of casting. And, it was the same sort of thing. He described what he wanted in the rod. We worked with the design, gave him a couple of samples. At this point, it was the 3rd series that we had worked with, only the 2nd full design. Actually, that's not true. It's not true. It was the 3rd full design. And we nailed that one pretty quickly. So he's got a 5.6 and a 7.8. And that did really well. Joe uses them in all of his lessons and, basically sells them at his lessons. People were learning to cast with these rods, and they want one. So that did well. That led then to the Debbie Hansen. Joe and Debbie were good friends down in the Fort Myers area, and Debbie is just phenomenal. She's a great guide, great personality, very, very much a big promoter of women in the sport. And so we started talking about doing a rod, and initially it was going to be a 7-weight rod and a spinning rod because Debbie guides with both. And we never quite got there with the spinning rod, but the fly rod was just, it was designed specifically for her. And the colors that she wanted, and the wraps at 18 and 24 inches, I think. So you can do a quick measurement on your fish. And we marketed that one mainly towards the ladies in the sport, but as of now, there's probably as many guys with that rod as there are gals.
Yeah, interesting. And then I know you've got another series before we talk about fiberglass, because I do want to talk about fiberglass a little bit, the Kildare series.
And that was actually the first rod series. And that was me just, I grew up fishing a 4-weight for trout, and I just wanted a really nice, comfortable 4-weight. And I worked with my friend in Pennsylvania and just said, okay, so here's where we want to get to. This is what I'm looking for. And I wanted a rod that could kind of do it all. Had enough reserve power that you could really launch out and into some wind if you needed to. But would also make a good nymphing rod and would also make a good dry fly rod. And those things almost can't exist in the same space, all those things together. The Kildare really does seem to do that. It's a great dry fly rod. It's a great nymphing rod, and it's got enough reserve power to punch out, 60-foot casts when you need it. Although, I'm always preaching you generally don't need 60-foot casts, and certainly not the 4-weight. But that was the first series, and I was thinking about my Irish heritage, about the soul of the Irish, and sort of all that feeling and emotion went into that rod design.
Yeah, very neat. And then you also have 2 fiberglass rods.
We do, and that was an interesting happening. Also, it was one night. I think we were at the Heartland Fly Fishing Show up in Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. The show that Joe Smith puts on every year to benefit Project Healing Waters, and we were in the hotel room one night, and it was Chuck and myself and a fellow named Dirk Fishback, who's been around the industry for a long time. And Dirk is just sort of he's a great fly fisherman, but he's a fly fishing historian as well. And he's one of those guys you can ask about almost any rod, and he can tell you its heritage, back to the beginnings. And we were just Chuck and I were both really getting schooled in this education of the old masters and what made those rods so good. And we were talking bamboo. And of course, there might have been a little bit of brown water involved in this conversation. And as it goes, eventually I don't know which one of us said it first, but I think it was on everybody's mind. It was like, I wonder if we can take some of those old tapers that were just so precious and try to translate them from bamboo to fiberglass. And, what would that be like? And we explored that for quite a while. And the first one that we thought about was one of Paul Young's designs, the Midge, which was a 6'8" or 9" 4-weight. And I went back to my blank guy and said, okay, Mike, this is what we're trying to do. And, he had the tapers because he builds bamboo rods. And I said, what we're trying to accomplish, and I know it's not going to be exactly like, but, a facsimile of. And, Mike knocked it out of the park with that fiberglass design. And honestly, he's probably the best fiberglass designer in the country right now. And so we left it with a nice sort of honey color blank that sort of makes you think of bamboo. Not flame darkened bamboo, but, some of the other lighter bamboo colors, very traditional wraps. And it, true to Paul Young's design, is a parabolic taper. And, it was one of those where we said, probably never going to sell a lot of because it's sort of a niche thing. But this gets back to, benefits of being a small company. But we just said, yeah, but it's a fun project, so let's do it. and we did. And actually, it's become a pretty popular little fiberglass rod. It's a blast to fish with. And I was never a short rod guy at all. It was always 9 foot or nothing. And this one really got me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what is it? Because the people that are into fiberglass are really into fiberglass. What is it that you think that draws people to that older technology?
In my opinion, and there's guys that certainly know much better than me, but in my opinion, one of the driving factors of sort of the fiberglass revolution, if you will, was what we talked about earlier, how the industry had just gone to faster and faster and faster rods. They were losing their feel. And there were the guys, the 40 and 50-year-olds like me, saying, oh my gosh, but what happened to the rods we grew up with? And they found that in fiberglass. And I think that's really, there's a little bit of nostalgia there, but I think they were just looking for a feel in the rods that they couldn't find anywhere else at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess I kind of think about, it's like those old Winston LTs, right? Pretty radically different from what Winston makes today.
Yep.
But yeah, it's really interesting. Are there any rod designs that you feel like you want to add to the Reilly Rodcrafter family of rods?
Oh, we've got a few in the works. Actually, I'm doing some prototype work now for some of my tarpon guides in a 8.5 foot 12 weight single piece, which has been kind of a fun project. Not sure, I know a lot of one piece rods are sort of making their way out on the market these days. Not sure where that's going to go, but I've spent some time with the second prototype casting it now, and I think it's going to certainly meet its targets. I mean, it's a strong rod, but still has plenty of feel. I'm getting more into some of the 10-footers. I did a series which we haven't launched yet, and I sort of provisionally named it the Sea Tuck, after the Seatuck River in Alaska. And it started with a 10-foot 7-weight, which was sort of the ideal size rod for the big steelhead in the larger waters up there. So we're talking about taking that further. And then we've got a saltwater series coming out also, a 4-piece saltwater series that I'm pretty excited about, but I'm not going to talk too much about it.
Fair enough. I don't want to jinx you, and there will be a trade show at some point.
At some point, yeah.
So from a design perspective, do you kind of, CAD draw out the prototypes, and then it sounds like you've got a partner up in Pennsylvania that kind of builds the prototypes for you? How does that design process kind of work until you get all the kinks out?
Yeah, a lot of trial and error, an awful lot of trial and error. We'll talk about what the taper needs to be, what kind of material and where, because, no blank is entirely, well, except for some of these fiberglass, but really no blank is entirely made up of a single material. So then we'll look for a mandrel that already exists in our library that is sort of close. And then we'll just start wrapping some blanks. Using, different materials, different overlaps, different layups. And, thankfully Mike has just a ton of experience there and usually knocks it out of the park pretty quickly. But I think it's very intuitive, at least for him. I work with some other guys as well. A guy that used to be one of the leading designers at St. Croix, and he's no longer with St. Croix. And he's much more the engineer of, we're going to work up the numbers and we'll do load analysis and get there. And he does a great job with that as well. But in the Pennsylvania shop, it's a lot of trial and error, and it's just gut experience.
Yeah. And obviously you're out and you field test them. So, once you have that aha moment like you had with Chuck in the 7-weight, tell us a little bit about, how and where your rods are manufactured.
So we wrap all of our rods. I have blanks that are done in higher volume, done in a shop out on the West Coast. In the less expensive rods, for instance, Joe's and Debbie's, we sent our design criteria overseas and had them prototyped overseas and have the blanks done over there. I think we're about to pull that back. It was important at the time, certainly to Joe, and I know where he was coming from, but it was important at the time to have a sub $300 rod. And there's no way you can do that by building the blank in the U.S. Right? It's virtually impossible. So we went offshore with those blanks. But everything else, the blanks are done either on the West Coast or they're done up in Pennsylvania. And we use family businesses as much as possible. And, U.S. made absolutely as much as possible. There's a couple of things, I can't get cork from the U.S., of course.
It's not in the Shenandoah Valley anywhere?
Yeah, no. That's a fertile valley, but no cork. I use, on some of our rods, I use a guy in Idaho that makes reel seeds. He'll turn the burl and he forges the nickel silver and etches them. And, we've got a small family business where we'll get rod tubes. And I've got a couple of ladies here. We call them WAM, Women's Auxiliary of Monticello, that actually sew rod socks for us. And, all of the rods are then wrapped by me. I have a guy up in Connecticut that's been building rods for 40-something years that does an awful lot of work for me as well. And I'm starting to branch out, and we're reaching out to some of the Project Healing Waters guys that learned to build rods and are really good at it and love it, but it's an expensive hobby. So, I'll get them set up with the equipment, send them some rod kits, have them build rods, and, I'll pay them for the rods that they complete.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes me think of like the stories of how it used to be like in Dan Bailey's shop out in Montana, right? Where he would, hire all of these housewives to tie flies for him.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Well, great dexterity, great attention to detail. Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, I mean, it's kind of like, you're sitting at the hub of this, with all these spokes feeding you all the pieces.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. And for us, it's always been very, very important to, do as much local as we humanly can. And then, if I've got to go elsewhere in the country for materials or items or service, then to do as much with small family-owned business as we possibly.
Yeah. Which is interesting because given the fact that, it's you or someone that you can basically reach out and touch that's wrapping the rods, I would imagine it's pretty easy for folks to customize their rods then.
It's very easy. It's absolutely very easy. And, we don't do a good job of talking about that on our website. But I always, when I talk to people personally or at shows, I encourage them, if you want some sort of a customization, let me know. The Midge, the mountain Midge, or little 4-weight fiberglass, I always have, 30, 40 reel seats on hand, and, I'll give people the option. When an order comes in, I'll email them and say, okay, so, here are the different reel seats we have. There's all these different burl woods. There's the dark nickel silver. There's the bright nickel silver. There's screw lock or there's slide bands. What would you like for your reel seat? And, people generally are pretty amazed. They're like, wow, I can make those choices? Well, yeah, I'm going to build it for you tomorrow, so you can.
Yeah, and at that price point, because your rods are not inexpensive, but they're not $1,000 or $1,200 sticks either.
No.
Right.
No. Yeah.
So, that is pretty amazing. What does that do in terms of lead time from the time someone places an order? And I'm sure it changes seasonally, but how long does it take, from the time people give you their credit card number until they get their rod?
If it's something that I'm going to customize, the answer is it depends. It depends on what sort of customization you want. If you want some initials or, some picture on your rod, I'm going to go to my decal folks in Tennessee, and that could take a week. If you're just wanting a different color wrap and it's colors that I have on hand or a different reel seat, realistically it's going to take a week. I almost never have anything out unless somebody wants something that I just don't even have the blank for. And then I've got to go to Pennsylvania and say, okay, I need this one. So why don't you roll me half a dozen? And that'll add a couple of weeks to it. But quite honestly, for a fully customized rod, worst case, 3 or 4 weeks, it's not bad.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And, it's interesting too, listening to you talk about your supply chain. It's probably really helped you avoid some of the COVID issues that a lot of other manufacturers have had.
Oh, it absolutely has. It absolutely has. But, to be perfectly honest, this last year was tough for us. My supply chain was in good shape. I could always get the materials when I needed it. But, we really had a slowdown this past year. In 2019, we did more than 3 times the business we did in 18, which 18 was 3 to 4 times the business we did in 17. By the end of the first quarter of 20, we were running about 350% of where we were same point the prior year. And then the phone stopped ringing. And, people were spending time outdoors because it's the one thing that they could do. But, people were worried about the economy. They were worried about their jobs. There were so many people that were unemployed. There wasn't a lot of money flowing.
Yeah.
So we ended up last year, probably back around 2018 levels.
Yeah, it's interesting too, listening to you talk about how you market your rods. It's one thing to go fish, but it's another thing to go fish with a guide, right? So
right.
You had so many fewer opportunities between that and probably, shows and club meetings, probably so many fewer opportunities to put your rods in people's hands.
That's exactly right. So, the business that we did last year was largely, just the repeats. And we've got a great, loyal following of customers. And that's important to us. And it's gratifying when you hear people say, and I see it in the reviews sometimes, that it's less like they're buying a rod from a rod company and more like they're buying a rod from their best friend.
Yeah.
And that's what we strive for. I mean, customers are everything. It's the business. And, customer service means an awful lot to me. And it's something that tends to be lacking sometimes these days. And, it's important that we treat everybody like we've known them for years and, how can we help you and what can we do for you?
Yeah. And so much of that to me kind of is that feeling you get when you kind of step back into that sporting tradition, from the 60s and the 70s, right? About how it was, right? And to me, that's what it feels like. And that's kind of what, when we talk about, what your rods feel like, that to me is sort of all comes together.
Right.
So all good stuff, Chris. I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with me this evening. Before I let you hop, why don't you let folks know where they can, learn more about Reilly Rod Crafters, follow you guys on social media, and all of your fishing adventures, and maybe a little bird hunting too.
Oh, I wish there were more bird hunting these days, but yeah, we're online. It's www.reillyrods.com, and Facebook is Reilly Rod Crafters. Instagram is Reilly Rod Crafters. All our contact information's on the website. Feel free to reach out. The guy that's going to answer it when you say, contact us and you send an email, it's coming straight to me. And I'll be the guy that answers it. And if it's something that I can't answer, then I'll let you know. I'm going to pass it off to one of my expert guides to give you better guidance. Please just feel free. Seek out one of our guides. Spend some time on the water with we deal with some of the best guides out there right now. And Joe Muller, Lord knows, probably one of the best casting instructors I've ever seen. And if you can get on his calendar, I would do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Chris, it's been great spending time with you this evening. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thanks, Marvin. You too.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, if you enjoyed the podcast, please tell a friend and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. And don't forget to check out the show notes for all the details for Blaine Chocolate's upcoming classes. Tight lines, everybody.